Let me now show you some pitfalls of the this keyword related to regular functions and arrow functions. This way we can learn when we should use and avoid each of them. And to start, let's get back the Jonas object from before. And I will also add a first name property. All right. And now let's add a second method here, but this time using an arrow function. So we will do a very simple greet method. And so an arrow function here, which simply logs to the console, hey, and then the name. And so we're going to take this name from the object. So this dot first name, or at least that's what we think we're doing. So let me now show you what happens as I call Jonas.greet. And maybe you can also anticipate it based on the knowledge that you already have of the this keyword when used in an arrow function. So let's see what the result is here. And we get hey undefined. So that's not hey Jonas as we might have expected. And the reason is exactly the one that I mentioned in the last lecture, which is the fact that an arrow function does not get its own this keyword. It will simply use the this keyword from its surroundings. So in other words, its parent's this keyword. And the parent scope of this greet method is the global scope. Okay. Just note here that this is actually not a code block. So you might think that like this kind of block here also creates its own scope, but it doesn't. So this is not a code block. It is an object literal. So it's just a way that we literally define objects. Okay. So all of this here is in the global scope still. And so therefore that includes this greet method. It is in the global scope. And so therefore the arrow function here, which does not have its own this keyword, will use the this keyword from the global scope. And remember, that is the window object, right? And so this dot first name is also undefined. And I think that this is actually something that we haven't seen before. So when we try to access a property that doesn't exist on a certain object, we do not get an error, but simply undefined. And so that is what is happening here. That's why we get undefined, because this is the window object. So just as we saw before, and then on the window object, there is no first name, and so we get undefined. Okay. And actually this behavior can become pretty dangerous in case we use var to declare variables. Because remember from a previous lecture that variables declared with var actually create properties on the global object. And so let's imagine we have this. So var first name equals Matilda. And so now as we run the greet function, it will say, hey Matilda. Okay, so why is that? So again, it is because inside of this function here, the this keyword is window. And actually let me print that here to the console as well, just so we can really see that here happening. Okay, so again, window is the this keyword inside of this arrow function, even though that arrow function was called by the Jonas object. But that rule does not apply here because, again, it's an arrow function. And so if we take a look at this window object now, and here close to F for first name, you see here that it does indeed have a property called first name with the value of Matilda. And again, that's because if we declare variables with var, that creates these kind of properties on the global object. And so therefore, this dot first name which translates to window that first name, is then Matilda. And so that's why we then get hey Matilda here. So that's yet another reason not to use var. So you see there's a pretty long list against var. So from this example, the big takeaway is that as a best practice, you should never ever use an arrow function as a method. And in my opinion, that's even true if you're not even using the this keyword in a particular method. Because if you have this rule of never using an arrow function as a method, then you never have to think about which type of function you should use. You will always just use a normal function expression, and like this, you will then prevent this kind of mistakes from happen. So this mistake that we saw here with hey Matilda is easy to prevent by simply not using var. But even then, hey undefined is still a bug. It's still not correct. And so that would have easily been avoided by just using a regular function. Right? If we had this, then of course now this object Jonas, which is calling the function, would then be the this keyword. Right? So you see first name Jonas and then hey Jonas. Because now this method actually does get its own this keyword. But let's put it back. And okay. Great. And now one final example of a pitfall of the this keyword is when we have a function inside of a method. And that is a pretty common thing to happen. And so let's now take a look at an example of that. So let's create another Jonas object here. Or actually don't. Actually, let's just use this object here that we already have. And let's enhance this calc_h method. So what I want in here is a function that will basically return if the person is a millennial. So easy enough, let's create an isMillennial function in here. And let's simply log to the console if this dot year is greater or equal 1981, and so that's the same rule that we used before, so that the birth year needs to stay between 1981 and 1996. So below 1996. And then let's also call that function right here. So isMillennial will be called as we call the calc_h function. So let's also do that. So jonas.calc_h. So we're calling this method here, the calc_h method, which is a regular method, so not an arrow function. And so therefore, the this keyword right here should be the Jonas object. But then in here we have a regular function, so this one, and here we are then calling it again. Now inside of this function, we are using the this keyword. And so let's now see what happens as we reload the page. And we get cannot read property year of undefined on line 138. So that's right here. So what this means is that the this keyword must be undefined. That's what it says here. So let's just log that as well. And here we can get rid of this one now. Okay. And indeed, the this keyword here is undefined. So why is that? Well, if we think about this, then this here is really just a regular function call, isn't it? It is a regular function call even though it happens inside of a method. And the rule says that inside a regular function call, which this clearly is, the this keyword must be undefined. And so therefore, it is undefined right here. So this is just as if this function was outside of this method. So if we copied this function out here, we would get the exact same result. Now, some people consider that this is a bug in JavaScript, but in my opinion, it's not really. It's just how the this keyword works. It's a clear rule that a regular function call has the this keyword set to undefined. And so that's just what is happening here. Now, there are two solutions to this problem. The first solution is to use an extra variable that we usually call self. So outside of the function, let's say self, and then we set that to this. Because here we are still outside of this isMillennial function. And so here we still have access to the this keyword set to Jonas, right? And so then in here, we can use simply self. And let's do that just here. And here I will duplicate this line so that we can keep the original one. And so now let's use self here. And so then through the scope chain, this self will be equal to this. So self is referenced here, but it's not, of course, in the scope. And so JavaScript goes up the scope chain into the parent scope, which is calc_h. And so here is where self is defined, and it is defined as this. So as the this keyword. And so this is a way in which we can preserve the this keyword. This can also be called that, so that you might also see. And so as we reload now, this actually works. So now we get the value of true. So this was kind of the pre-ES6 solution, but you might still find this solution in some older code bases. However, now in ES6, we have a more modern and better solution. And that solution is to use an arrow function. All right. So let's actually copy all of this because I want to preserve both versions here. And now I will just comment out this first. Let's say solution 1. But now here we have solution 2, which does not need this extra variable. Okay, so let's get rid of this, bring this back, and here, this again. And now, again, the solution to the problem that we saw before is that we can now use an arrow function. And that is going to work because the arrow function does not have its own this keyword. Right? So let's remember again that when we just call this, we get that the this keyword is undefined. And that's because a regular function gets its own this keyword. But the arrow function will not. It will simply use the this keyword of its parent scope. And in this case, that will be the calc_h method. And in here, the this keyword is Jonas, so the Jonas object. And therefore, then, here in an arrow function, that would also be the this keyword. And then it is going to work as expected. And indeed, now it is true. And again, this worked because this arrow function uses the this keyword from its parent scope. And in this case, in the parent scope, the this keyword is Jonas. So basically, an arrow function inherits the this keyword from the parent scope. And that is exactly what we need here. All right. And so here you see that it's pretty important to know exactly how each of the different type of functions work in regard to the this keyword, because then you can really use them according to your specific needs. Great. So I hope that especially this solution here made sense to you, and that when you need it at some point in your journey or in your job, you can remember that this is a very useful use case of the arrow function. Now, just to finish this lecture, I also want to quickly touch on the arguments keyword. Maybe you remember me talking about that also in a previous lecture. So in the video about execution contexts and the call stack, we learned that functions also get access to an arguments keyword. So not just the this keyword, but also an arguments keyword. Now, just like the this keyword, the arguments keyword is only available in regular functions. So let's create another function here. So first an expression. So again, basically that's our functions for adding. And actually, let me just grab them from here. I think I defined them somewhere up here. Yes. So there's no need to rewrite the same code over and over again. You just add a comment here, arguments, key, word. And then let me also print to the console that keyword. So let me quickly call this function here now. So 2 and 5. So just so we see the arguments keyword. And so down here it is. And you see that we get basically an array with 2 and 5. And so that's exactly the two parameters that we passed in. And this can be useful when we need a function to accept more parameters than we actually specified. So this is something that we never did before. So up until this point, we have only ever specified exactly the arguments that we have here in the list of parameters. So we have two parameters and so two arguments. But it is completely legal to add more arguments. They will not have a name, so we didn't name them, but they exist. And we can see them here in the arguments array. All right? So they do appear here, and we can use them, therefore, in the functions. For example, we could use a loop and then loop over this array and add all the numbers together. But now my point here is that the arrow function does not get this keyword. So let's also log it to the console here. So let's put this here in curly braces. Then remember, when we have more than one line of code, we need to explicitly return. And so let's try to take a look at the arguments keyword here as well. So add arrow 2, 5, 8, let's say. But then we get an error. So arguments is not defined. All right. So this was simply just to show you that the arguments keyword exists, but that it only exists in regular functions. So in function expressions like this, but also in function declarations, but not in an arrow function. But anyway, the arguments keyword is not that important in modern JavaScript anymore, because now we have a more modern way of dealing with multiple parameters. But still, it's important that you are aware that this arguments keyword exists. All right. And now with all these lectures on regular functions and arrow functions, you should know all the differences between them and, even more importantly, when to use each of them.